on the Industrial Revolution. It's a topic I've been reading quite a lot about recently. Took me a few months, but I've managed to get through the whole of Joel Mokyr's The Enlightened Economy, which is quite a long-winded description of the various factors and events which took place in what we today call the Industrial Revolution. If we think about what the Industrial Revolution was, I think that by and large it is the use of machines to produce things. That could be the simplest definition of what the Industrial Revolution was. It's the replacement of hands, of manual labour, with designed machines which are much more productive, thousands of times more productive. And this begins to take place in Britain in the late 18th century. It's not clear precisely when it started. You could see the development of the Industrial Revolution in the Agricultural Revolution, which preceded it. And it was the improvements in farming which came about primarily due to improvements in the technology used. There was one particular tool that was invented in the early 18th century, which enabled the planting of crops to be much more efficient. There was a machine. It was almost a glorified wheelbarrow, but what that enabled is the planting of crops in a more or less straight line. And so what you see throughout the 18th century is enormous improvement. Britain was the best farming nation in the world at this point. And the abundance of food meant that large towns could later be supported. What the invention of a number of machines, there was also something called enclosure. And enclosure took place over hundreds of years. And what this was the privatisation of land. And it began, it's believed to have begun as early as the 14th century. But what essentially was taking place in Britain over hundreds of years was that land that was communal. So prior to the Industrial Revolution, majority of people live on land. They work in the farms, they use their hands, they're working all day long, labouring in the fields, growing crops, growing food, which they consume, and it's an agricultural lifestyle. And what happens over a number of centuries is that land becomes bought and owned by a smaller number of people, and enclosure meant that land was much more professionally farmed, in the sense that when it became a commodity, strictly defined in size, that led to the use of it being much more productive. A large amount of what motivated the entire agricultural revolution and later the industrial revolution is profit. So people wanted land. Land across the centuries is one of the main causes of war because it was the most valuable thing in the feudal era. People owned the land and people worked on the land. So the ownership of land is a very important fact that needs to be understood when looking at European history, also world history, but we're looking at the agricultural revolution. And so the privatisation of land meant that, so the privatisation of land, in addition to the invention of a number of machines and the great increase in productivity, meant that people suddenly became out of work. So they were no longer needed on the farm. So they needed employment, they needed jobs, so they moved to the city. And this is where you see the start of the Industrial Revolution beginning to take place. People began to work in factories, and the first machines that really began to be used on an industrial scale were the ones used in the textile industry in Lancashire. So this was quite a particular thing that happened, but essentially, so let me just write this down so we've got the sequence of events more or less correct. One of the criticisms I would make of Joel Mokyr's book is that it's very descriptive, but it's not very explanatory, in the sense that what I found with the book, it's a very large book. It took me approximately 2 months to get through the entire book. He doesn't really have a strong sense of clarity of how these phenomena and events took place in a causal way. He kind of describes all of the different things that were taking place. It is a very good book because it does pretty much cover all the different things that were going on in this period. He's writing about the period 1700 to 1850. So he looks at enclosure, which is the privatisation of land, and then you see the agricultural revolution, which dramatically increases the productivity of land and the abundance of food, and the use of machines which replace workers in the field. And so you see a massive movement towards cities where people started to work in factories. Now, the reason why Great Britain was the first nation to industrialise was partly because of the geographical conditions that are quite unique to Great Britain. First of all, we have many rivers and many canals and relatively heavy rainfall compared to other European countries. So in Lancashire, you see the development of factories based on hydraulic power. And what this essentially is so then you have the Lancashire textile industry, and what this effectively replaced was what was known as a cottage industry, in which prior to the development of factories, where people would go to a specific place where there would be machines and people working on those machines to produce clothes, there was a cottage industry throughout Lancashire. People were taking wool from the sheep, and they were weaving and spinning the cloth themselves in their own homes, and the invention of a number of machines. So what's happened at the start of the Industrial Revolution, particularly with regards to the manufacturing of textiles, and it's the manufacturing of textiles, the textile industry, that makes Great Britain the superpower of the 19th century, and by far the most prosperous nation in the world, really. And it all came from Lancashire, and the invention of a number of machines. One of them was the flying shuttle, and what this enabled the user to do was to take all of those threads and just enable the spinning and the weaving of threads into cloth, into clothes, essentially, and those clothes would be exported overseas and could be traded for other goods. And you see, generally, in this period, a growth in world trade. Britain, the #1 textile manufacturing nation, trading tea, coffee, sugar, tobacco, other things with other nations. So this was also taking place at this time. But you see inventions like the flying shuttle, the spinning jenny. These machines mean that the manufacturing of cloth is 100 times greater than it would be if just humans. Often it was women. Women would sit there and they would thread, wool into clothes. Going on at the same time, there was another development in the United States. Cotton, for example, is not native to Great Britain, but then cotton becomes an important part of the Industrial Revolution later on. But that's not strictly important for the development of the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain. So you have a number of machines, and you can check these out on YouTube. There are many great videos that you can watch. There's actually a number made by someone called Fred Dibnall, and he's an enthusiastic studier of the Industrial Revolution, and particularly the machines that were used, and he goes through all of these different things. So it's well worth checking out the videos he's made. He's from Bolton, and he grew up in the 1950s when smoke from the chimneys could still be seen when he was a young boy, and Britain was still using coal in the 1950s. And he talks about this era in quite a lucid, detailed way. And there are other documentaries you can watch on this topic as well, including a documentary inside a factory in one of the Lancashire mills, and you can see how these machines actually worked. Very noisy factories. The people working there, many of them went deaf after 10 years of working in these places, because the noise of these machines constantly churning away made people deaf. That's how noisy they were. But the reason why Lancashire is important is because you have streams, and they would build these mills along the river. Britain was lucky in a sense as well, because we have rivers, and we made canals as an internal transportation system prior to the invention of the steam engine and trains. So trains eventually replaced the canal, but the canal is probably an underappreciated element of why Great Britain was the first to industrialise. But what essentially is taking place in these factories, so they have these machines, flying shuttle and spinning jenny, and these machines multiplied the amount of textiles Britain was able to manufacture by 1,000 times. Incredibly productive, supplied much of the world with clothes, with textiles. And so these machines became powered by flowing water. And effectively what that is, so you have a river flowing in one direction, and all they really did, people think that these machines were incredibly complex, relative to what we have today in terms of the technology we have. This is very simple technology. All they did in the 1770s, 1780s, 1790s was they built a factory, and next to the river there would be a wheel, and the flowing, we can't draw this very well, but the flowing nature of the river is going to turn this gigantic wheel, and this gigantic wheel weighed many tons. And then what they did, there was a number of pulleys and belts attached to this wheel, and this powers the machines that they used in these factories. And there would just be rows of them continuously working away, churning out cloth. And so this is the start of the Industrial Revolution. Later on, one of the other key reasons why Britain was the first to industrialise was because of the abundance of coal in the coal fields, particularly in the north of England, in Yorkshire, in Derbyshire, up in the northeast of course, up in Durham. And coal became very important because what they effectively did was they burned it, and the steam engine replaces the water mill. The businessmen, the people that owned these factories, very wealthy, rich men, they preferred steam engines because they were much more predictable in terms of what they're putting in, what they're getting out. With the older water mill, it's dependent on how much rain falls, and so the steam engine is preferable because they can know precisely how much energy they're putting into the system by how much coal they're burning, and it's just a more productive step forward with regards to the productivity that is possible with the improvement in this technology. So you see the water mills, and then the use of coal. Now, interestingly, the use of steam and the steam power all came from inventions and innovations that were made due to coal mining. So one of the things they had to do when mining for coal is to take all of the water out of the coal mine. They had to drain all of the water out, they had to pump it out. And so in trying to get the coal from deep in the earth, miles underground, requires constant innovation. There's money to be made as well, so the whole thing is motivated by people wanting to make lots of money, and so they're constantly innovating and improving the technology. But the use of steam power was first used to pump water out of the coal mine, and you see this reinforcing cycle where one invention leads to more productivity in a certain area, and then another invention is discovered and that leads to higher productivity. So there's a virtuous cycle being created of invention and of innovation during this whole period. It's little changes constantly being made, which has the radical improvements that you see from 1750 to today. Because one of the things, if you define the Industrial Revolution as the transition towards a time when productivity, what is being produced, what is being manufactured, and the idea of people going to work, going to the factory, going to the place of work, if you define it in those terms, what's also came about due to factorization is, for the first time, people's lives were ruled by the clock. And this is probably an underestimated aspect of life, because prior to the Industrial Revolution, people just got up when it was light outside, they did their work, but the factory makes everything much more efficient and need to measure things precisely. So you see an increase in precision regarding the organisation of people's lives throughout this period. But the steam engine became very important, because then you see the invention of trains, steam trains, and Britain was the first to have these. I think the first steam train was from Darlington to Stockton, and it was to transport coal. But Britain was the first country to have steam trains, and they were a key part of why Britain was so successful, because it was able to transport huge, heavy material around to where they were needed. And also what Britain had was iron ore, an abundance of iron, which could be made into steel, and that steel was used to build train tracks, huge heavy machinery, which again, going back to the idea of the virtuous cycle, helps to produce even better machines that are constantly innovating and getting constantly better. So you see the coal and the use of coal in people's homes as well. The Industrial Revolution is often associated with the burning of coal, and cities full of smog and black smoke. and Britain has this in abundance. One area the book focuses on, so the book is called The Enlightened Economy, and what the author is trying to do is, the book is about not necessarily the technological developments, although he does go into those in quite some detail. He tries to talk about the underlying philosophical development which took place prior to the Industrial Revolution. So the era of Enlightenment, sometimes called the Age of Reason. I think it was Thomas Paine that called the 18th century the Age of Reason. But the Enlightenment era, he doesn't go into too much detail, but he suggests that this had something to do with the Reformation in Great Britain and the rise of the middle class, which had certain values. He talks about the cultural dimension that was important, and the high level of trust that people had in that era, which enabled the country to develop because it was so settled. Property rights, for example, never came under question in the same way they did in France. So France had a huge revolution in 1789, a very tumultuous time, and this set France way back. So by the time 1820, 1830, Britain is way ahead because it was so stable. And he talks about in the book how the political system in Great Britain was remarkably stable, in that one of the aspects of it, for example, was that the middle class weren't paying taxes. And the British were quite clever because they applied taxes on consumable goods. So you'd have to pay a tax if you wanted to buy sugar, tea, coffee, tobacco. And that's how the British state was able to collect revenue in a much more subtle way that didn't lead to the resentment that was found on the continent. And so Britain is a remarkably stable political entity. The other obvious reason why Great Britain at this time was able to take such a leap forward was simply because it was an island, and at this time the only way to invade an island, the continent, there were constant wars taking place and uncertainty, but of course if you're an island nation, all you really need to do to defend that nation is have a great navy, and the British Navy at this time was second to none. That British Navy also helped to build a global empire which supported British trade and enabled it to carry on, take place without huge problems. If there was a threat to this global network of trade, the British Navy would of course move in to protect it. So that was a big factor as well. He does talk about Francis Bacon quite a lot in the book as well, and he regards the Industrial Revolution as a product of a strain of thinking which sees the utility of science as being essential. In other words, knowledge should be applied in useful ways. John Locke, philosopher in the late 18th century, makes this point as well, in that he believes that education should be about the teaching of useful knowledge that actually is going to improve people's lives. And he regards this particular emphasis on the way people thought in Britain that was different on the continent, in that people saw science and they thought about how they could use it to increase productivity and produce goods which are going to improve society. So he goes into that to a large extent as well. He talks about the changes that took place in cities. You know, the Industrial Revolution brought about quite a lot of upheaval as well in its time. in around 1810, there was a huge protest, I think in Manchester. There was the Luddite movement, and this essentially was men that were angry because they thought that their jobs were being taken over by machines, they were being replaced by these huge factories with these machines that made them and their work, their hands, their skills almost redundant. So they went into these factories and they smashed some of these machines, in anger. But the British government did support the industry because from the national government's point of view, the textile industry, the way they thought at that time was that Britain needs to be competitive with France, with Spain, with the Netherlands, and that the country as a whole needed to be profitable. They needed to produce textile goods to be traded, and so they were always on the side of the capitalists, of those that owned the factories and that were producing. Even though for the commoner, the common man, that led to some changes that he didn't directly benefit from. There is some debate about when precisely the conditions for the poorest began to improve as a result of the use of machines. Some, for example, say that living conditions were significantly better by the year 1850, relative to what they were when many of those people not so long ago would have been working on farms in the country. So there is some debate about this. Some people argue that in some industrial town in the north of England, very unsafe, there were problems that existed due to the mass movement of people to the cities. Sanitation, for example. I think there was a cholera outbreak in the early 19th century that was caused by lots of people moving into an area very quickly, and for the infrastructure not to have been built up to cope with the pressures caused by this sudden urbanisation which took place across Great Britain. But the book is an interesting book. I would say it's probably best to start if you're interested in this topic, and this topic is one of the most important events, this period, in world history, because nowadays we have so much leisure time and so many things we can buy and we can enjoy, and it all comes from this time when the factory and manufacturing goods, people coming together with their skills. Adam Smith talks about the specialisation of labour, which he regards as synonymous with the productivity of a nation increasing, because people get really good at doing one particular thing, and the use of machines and people using these machines in highly efficient ways. In some sense, that mindset is still with us today, in that people expect progress. People expect the iPhone or their mobile phone or their TV or their video games console to improve, and things generally improve every year. Technology constantly getting better, and so progress is clearly the belief in progress and the idea of progress and the means by which progress is achieved. This dramatically accelerates in Great Britain in the late 18th century. Prior to this, people's lives were more or less the same as they had been for hundreds of years. People living in houses together, families, not really aware of what's going on, even in the nearby village, let alone in another country. People just doing their thing and not really thinking too much about the world at large, which all begins to change, particularly with the advent of the steam train, because of course if you're building a train line from, let's say, Manchester to London, they need to arrive precisely at given times. And so everything becomes more synchronised, highly organised, knowledge from Manchester travels to London, knowledge from London travels to Manchester. The mixing of ideas, very important, and of course on the continent probably that was more influential because of course they can travel between countries as well by train, so you see the mixture of ideas in a much more diverse way in a sense on the continent. So all of this period is very interesting. It's definitely worth starting with the Industrial Revolution because I think that the principles by which modernity was invented and the world as we understand it today is a relatively recent thing. This whole period of Industrial Revolution has dramatically shaped the world as we know it today. So I would recommend the book. My only criticism of it would be that it's not as clear as it could have been as a sequence of events which took place, which taken together results in history as we understand it regarding what happened. It seems it's a bit cloudy. It moves from one event to another event. It's quite repetitive as well. It repeats points quite a lot in the book. So I think it's a quite good book. There are many books on the topic of the Industrial Revolution. And I'll make a video about some more in the future that perhaps are simple starting points from which you can go in and zoom into specific details about these machines, for example. Because within the spinning jenny, there's a history of the spinning jenny and how that evolved and changed and adapted, and the modifications that took place, just on that one detail, because we're talking about a period of history. But just as an oversight of what happened, I'm sure there are some other books which just give you sort of a broad view, and then if you want you can zoom in and look at specific things which took place. But the basics of it are that Britain, just prior to the start of the Lancashire textile industry, was a remarkably settled nation that had the best farming industry in the world, and the machines that were used on the farm, in addition to enclosure, privatisation of land, led more people to the city in search of employment. Here they start to work in factories and industrial towns, and the use of machines greatly improves the productivity of Great Britain, huge exporting nation. The fact that it's an island nation and the Royal Navy, very powerful instrument that's used to support global trade, and this huge empire that Britain built in the 18th and 19th centuries is an interesting and has a huge bearing on the world today. So I would say check it out, do some research, because I feel like everyone should have at least some knowledge of the Industrial Revolution and actually what happened. It's one of the most important parts of Britain's history. So check it out. I'll post another video at a future date on it because there are some other books I'm going to read and review. But hopefully this book gives you a little bit of insight into the Industrial Revolution and encourages you to go and read some books, find some books, watch some documentaries, go to the museums. You can go to the North of England, you can go to see the trains. There's a train museum in York, there's a coal mining museum. I think there's a colliery in South Wales. You can actually go down into the coal mine and you can find out more about this industry, which employed millions of men every day, getting up at 7 o'clock in the morning, say, down there in the coal mine, and then they spent 12 hours down there, and all they were doing was digging up the coal. Incredibly dangerous work, and that coal powered all of these machines up on the surface, until later on when electricity replaces this older technology. And of course today, we have nuclear power that we use, and of course in some sense, I wouldn't say we're going backwards, I'd say definitely we're going forwards, but we're using more wind turbines for environmental reasons. So this history of energy, in particular, without all of the other inventions that took place, just looking at energy, because energy is one of the most important aspects of an economy. When you have an abundant energy source, and the entire industrial revolution, you can think about it almost as the use of energy for productive means that were profitable to innovators, something like that. It's all about using the natural forces, the wind, the rivers, and the steam, and using that energy to power machines to produce goods that are sold across the world. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon. See you soon. Thank you.